You know what kept me away from Kumiko for years? I'd see those stunning geometric lattice panels online, those impossibly precise wooden patterns where every piece locks together like a puzzle, and I'd think, that's not for me. That's a lifetime of training. That's a guy in Kyoto who's been doing this since he was 14 years old, and his father did it before him, and his grandfather before that. I figured you needed hands that could feel the difference between a 60-degree angle and a 60.5-degree angle without even looking. Then, about 3 years ago, I finally got to watch a Kumiko craftsman work up close. And you know what I saw on his bench? Jigs. Simple wooden jigs everywhere. That's when it clicked. The precision doesn't come from superhuman skill, it comes from fixtures. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly how that works and why a handful of dumb, repeatable jigs can let a beginner produce a clean Asa no Ha pattern on their very first serious attempt. Plus, stick around to the end, because I'll show you a notch-cutting trick I picked up that made my first panel actually come together. Let's talk about what we're really dealing with here. Kumiko is one of the most visually striking woodworking traditions on the planet, and it's been around for centuries. But the thing that makes it worth your time isn't just how beautiful it is. It's that the underlying system is far more accessible than it looks, once you understand what's actually driving the precision. So let me start with where this craft comes from and why that matters. Kumiko developed in Japan primarily as the internal lattice work for shoji screens, those sliding paper-covered room dividers you've probably seen in photographs of traditional Japanese homes. It was also used in ranma, the decorative transom panels that sit above doorways and interior openings. The craft really flourished during the Edo period, roughly the early 1600s through the mid-1800s, when Japan experienced a long stretch of relative peace and prosperity. That meant more resources going into architecture, interior design, and the decorative arts. Woodworkers during this era were organized into guilds and apprenticeship systems that could last a decade or more. A young apprentice would spend years just learning to sharpen tools and prepare stock before he ever cut a Kumiko joint. And that's the part that intimidates people today. We hear 10-year apprenticeship, and we assume the skill ceiling is impossibly high. But here's what I learned when I started digging deeper. A huge part of what those apprentices were doing during all those years wasn't developing some magical hand-eye coordination that you and I will never have. They were learning to make jigs. They were learning to build the fixtures, the guides, the pairing blocks, and the shooting boards that make Kumiko repeatable. The master craftsman's real secret wasn't in his fingers. It was in his understanding of the system. He knew that if you control the process controls the result. There's a concept in traditional Japanese woodworking that I keep coming back to. It roughly translates to let the tool do the work, but it's broader than that. It really means design your process so that precision is built into the setup, not dependent on your performance in the moment. That's a philosophy that American woodworkers rarely hear, but once you internalize it, everything about Kumiko opens up. Now let me show you the two things that make or break every single Kumiko panel, because once you understand this, the whole craft stops being mysterious. Every Kumiko pattern, whether it's a simple square grid or a complex Asa no Ha hemp leaf design, depends on exactly two variables. The first is uniform strip thickness. Every strip in the lattice has to be precisely the same width and the same thickness. Not close, not pretty good, the same. The second variable is exact, repeatable angles on the infill pieces. Those are the little leaf shapes, the spokes, the half-lap pieces, that create the decorative pattern inside the grid. Each one has to be cut to the same precise angle every single time. Here's why those two things matter so much. Kumiko is an additive system. You're assembling dozens, sometimes hundreds of small pieces into a single panel, and every tiny deviation gets multiplied across the whole assembly. If your strips vary by even 5/1000ths of an inch in thickness, by the time you've assembled 40 of them across a panel, that error has compounded into a visible gap or a bow that you cannot fix. Same thing with angles. If your 60-degree cuts are actually 59.5 on some pieces and 60.3 on others, the pattern won't close. The pieces won't seat. You'll be forcing things, and forced Kumiko is failed Kumiko. When I first understood this, something shifted for me. I realized the reason Kumiko looks like it requires superhuman skill is because the tolerance is so tight. But tight tolerance doesn't have to mean high skill. It can mean good fixtures. And that's exactly what the traditional craftsmen figured out centuries ago. Let's start with the first jig, the one that gives you uniform strips every single time. In a traditional Japanese shop, the craftsman would use a wooden thicknessing jig that's almost embarrassingly simple. It's essentially a channel cut into a block of hardwood, sized so that your rough strip sits inside it with just a hair of material proud above the surface. You run a sharp hand plane across the top of the block, and the plane takes off exactly the amount of material that's sticking up. Flip the strip, do the other side. Every strip comes out identical because the jig determines the dimension, not your eye. For a typical Asa Noha panel, you're working with strips that are somewhere around 3/16 of an inch thick and about 3/4 of an inch tall, though dimensions vary with the scale of your panel. The key is that whatever dimension you choose, every single strip has to match. The wood species matters here too. Traditional Japanese Kumiko uses hinoki cypress, which is tight-grained, stable, and planes beautifully. If you're working in the States, Port Orford cedar is probably the closest equivalent. Basswood works well for a first project because it's forgiving and inexpensive. Straight-grained white pine is another option, though it's a little soft for really fine work. Whatever you choose, you want clear, straight grain with no knots and no runout. I built my first thicknessing jig out of a piece of hard maple in about 45 minutes. Nothing fancy. Just a straight channel, a flat reference surface, and a sharp block plane. And the first time I ran a dozen strips through it, I checked them all with a caliper. The variation was less than 2/1000ths of an inch across the whole batch. That's when I thought, okay, this is going to work. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these ancient methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Kenji's Workshop, and it is a collection of 100 ancient Eastern woodworking secrets for the modern craftsman. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now that you have consistent strips, the second jig is where the real magic happens. This is the angle jig, and it's the thing that lets you cut repeatable angles on those tiny infill pieces without measuring, without marking, and without eyeballing anything. For the Asa Noha hemp leaf pattern specifically, the critical angle is 60 degrees. The pattern is built on a hexagonal geometry, so every infill piece meets at 60 degrees or its complement, 120 degrees. In a traditional Japanese shop, the craftsman uses what's essentially a paring block. It's a small hardwood fixture with a face cut to exactly 60 degrees. You lay your infill piece against the face, and you pare or saw right along the edge. The angle is built into the jig. Your job is just to hold the piece firmly and make a clean cut. Let me tell you what happened when I tried cutting Asa Noha pieces freehand before I made this jig. I laid out 60-degree lines on about 20 small pieces using a combination square and a protractor. I cut them carefully with a fine-toothed pull saw. And when I went to assemble the pattern, maybe 8 of them fit well. The rest were off by just enough that the pattern had visible gaps, and the pieces wouldn't seat by friction alone. I was frustrated. Then I made a simple paring block from a scrap of white oak, checked the angle with a reliable square, and cut the same number of pieces using the jig. Every single one dropped into the grid cleanly. Same saw, same hands, same day. The only difference was the fixture. The traditional craftsmen I've studied often have a whole set of these pairing blocks for different patterns. A 60-degree block for asa no ha, a 45-degree block for patterns based on square geometry, a 30-degree block for star patterns. Each one is a simple piece of hardwood with a precisely cut face. There's nothing complex about any of them, but together, they represent the entire vocabulary of Kumiko angles, ready to go whenever you need them. With your strips thicknessed and your angle jig ready, this is where Kumiko starts to feel almost meditative. You're cutting small infill pieces, each one maybe 1.5 inches to 2 inches long, each with a tiny half-lap notch at the center that lets it interlock with the grid. And because your jig is controlling the angle, you can settle into a rhythm. Cut, check, set aside. Cut, check, set aside. Every piece comes out the same. When you start assembling an asa no ha panel, you work from the outside in. Your base grid goes together first, those uniform strips slotted into the frame with half-lap joints at every intersection. Then, the infill pieces, the leaf shapes, get pressed into position one at a time. And here's the moment that made me fall in love with Kumiko. When your angles are right and your strips are consistent, the pieces just drop in. No hammering, no forcing, no glue, no nails. Just wood meeting wood with a satisfying little click as friction holds everything in place. I remember putting the last piece into my first asa no ha panel and just staring at it. 45 minutes earlier, I had a pile of small sticks on my bench. Now I was looking at this geometric pattern that looked like it belonged in a museum. And I hadn't done anything skillful in the traditional sense. I just let the jigs do their job. The visual check for good Kumiko is straightforward. Hold the panel up to a light source. Every opening in the pattern should be the same size and shape. If you see one that's slightly larger or one where the pieces don't quite touch, you know exactly where the error is. But if your jigs are right, that light test is just a victory lap. Now, I want to be honest with you because the title of this video says, "Without skill," and I owe you some straight talk about what that really means. Jigs genuinely collapse the learning curve from years to an afternoon. That part is true, and I stand behind it completely. But there are things jigs cannot replace. First, your tools have to be sharp, not hardware store sharp, genuinely, properly sharp. The hand plane you use on the thicknessing jig needs to be honed to the point where it leaves a polished surface on the wood. The saw you use for half-lap notches needs to cut cleanly without tearing. If your tools are dull, no jig in the world will save you. Second, you need patience. Kumiko is repetitive work. You might cut 60 or 80 identical pieces for a single panel. If you start rushing, you'll get sloppy. And sloppy shows up immediately in the assembled pattern. Third, wood selection and grain direction still matter. You want to orient the grain so that your tiny pieces are strong, not fragile. Short grain on a 1.5-inch infill piece means it'll snap when you try to press it into the grid. You have to pay attention to that. But here's the honest truth. Sharp tools, patience, and basic grain awareness are things any woodworker can bring to the bench on day one. They're not skills that take years to develop. So when I say jigs make Kumiko accessible without years of practice, I mean it. You still need to show up with care and attention. But the precision that makes Kumiko look impossible, that's in the fixtures. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself, that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is eyeballing angles instead of jigging them. Most of us will mark a line with a protractor, cut close, and then try to adjust. In Kumiko, that approach fails immediately because the errors compound. The traditional method eliminates measuring from the cutting process entirely. The jig is the measurement. The second pattern is accepting inconsistent strip stock. I used to rip strips on my table saw and figure they were close enough. But close enough across 40 strips means your panel racks or gaps. The thicknessing jig forces consistency that a table saw fence alone cannot guarantee, especially on pieces this small. The third pattern is forcing pieces during assembly. When something doesn't fit, most of us' instinct is to tap it in with a mallet or add a little glue. In Kumiko, if a piece doesn't drop in by hand pressure alone, something is wrong. Forcing it just locks the error into the panel and pushes it into the adjacent pieces. The traditional approach is to go back to the jig and cut a new piece. It takes 30 seconds and solves the problem permanently. The fourth pattern is over-sanding Kumiko strips. I see this constantly. People sand their strips smooth before assembly, which rounds over the edges and kills the crisp intersections that make Kumiko beautiful. Traditional Japanese craftsmen plane their strips to final dimension and leave the planed surface as the finished surface. No sandpaper touches Kumiko. Once you see these patterns for what they are, you start working differently, not harder, just more deliberately. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is the notch cutting trick that made my first Asa no Ha panel actually come together, and I've never seen it explained clearly anywhere else. When you're cutting the tiny half-lap notches in your infill pieces, the depth of that notch has to be exactly half the thickness of the strip. Not approximately half, exactly half. If it's too deep, the joint is sloppy, too shallow, and the pieces won't interlock. Here's what I do. I take a scrap of the same strip stock I'm using for the panel and I cut it in half along its thickness. I use that offcut as a depth gauge. I set it next to my chisel, mark the chisel with a tiny piece of tape at that depth, and now I have a built-in depth stop for every notch I pare. It's the same principle as the angle jig. You're building the measurement into the setup so you don't have to think about it in the moment. The first time I used this method, I cut about 30 notches in a row, and every single one was within 1/1000th of an inch of the target depth. My previous attempts, without the depth reference, had been all over the place. This one small trick turned the most fiddly part of Kumiko into the most reliable part. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best ancient Eastern woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called Kenji's Workshop. 100 techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with step-by-step photos and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and I will see you in the next one.